Welcome to Tales of Bygone Years. Today's story will take you deep into the frozen heart of Alaska, a place where silence can be deadly and survival is a test of the soul. He came seeking peace. He found isolation. For 57 days, he fought against nature itself. This is his story. Sit back, take a deep breath, and enjoy the tale of 57 Days Alone in Alaska. The snow groaned under his boots with every step. He moved slowly, careful not to waste strength, leaning on a crooked alder stick that had already saved him from several falls. The world was a vast white desert, silent and merciless, and yet it pressed on him like a heavy hand. His face was raw from the wind, his lips cracked and bleeding, his breath escaping in small white clouds that vanished instantly. 49 days. He had stopped counting mornings and nights long ago, but the number still echoed in his head like a curse. The silence around him was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that screamed in the ears, louder than any storm. Even his own heartbeat seemed too noisy here, as if the wilderness demanded he vanish completely into its stillness. Every sound, a branch creaking in the distance, the distant caw of a raven, made him pause, listen, and wonder if the land itself was alive and watching. He lowered his gaze to the snow. The tracks he left behind were already filling with wind-blown powder. Soon, even those faint signs of his existence would vanish. Out here, time erased everything: footsteps, voices, even hope. His mind replayed the same thought over and over. Keep moving, don't stop. Stopping was surrender. Stopping meant lying down, closing his eyes, and never opening them again. His hunger was constant, sharp and gnawing, a dull wolf chewing at his ribs. He had learned to live with it, to manage the emptiness by breaking food into the smallest of rations. Sometimes he chewed on nothing but spruce needles just to fool his body into believing he was eating. The cold was different. The cold was not a visitor inside him. It was a predator outside, always pressing, always waiting for weakness. He adjusted the strap of his pack. It was far lighter than when he started, but not in a good way. Inside, there was only a small piece of hard bread, a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, and a few scraps of dried meat he was saving like treasure. Even the tea bags had become valuable, small rituals of warmth that gave him a reason to keep the fire going at night. He thought of fire now and quickened his steps. The memory of flames licking at the tin pot, the steam rising from melting snow, the heat soaking into his bones. It was not just survival, it was life itself. Without fire, he knew he would last less than 2 nights. With it, he had endured 49 days. The wind shifted, and a cloud of fine snow lifted from the ground, swirling around him like ghosts. He pulled his hood tighter, but the cold crept in anyway, finding every gap in his clothing. He whispered to himself. Not even words, just sounds, as though the noise could keep the silence from swallowing him whole. His voice was thin, but it reminded him he still existed. He stopped for a moment, pressing the stick into the snow, and raised his head. The horizon stretched endlessly, pale and merciless. No roads, no signs of people, only white plains broken by the black spires of spruce trees. Somewhere in that vastness was safety, a way back to life, but for now all he had was the rule he had carved into his mind. Step, breathe, survive. And so he moved again, boots crunching, body aching, carrying himself forward into the frozen silence, refusing to let the land decide his ending. His journey had not begun in silence. Weeks earlier, there had been noise, too much of it. The crowded city, the endless traffic, the constant hum of people moving with their schedules and ambitions. He had felt suffocated by it all. That was why Alaska had sounded like freedom. A place where the air was clear, where a man could hear his own thoughts without the roar of engines or the glow of screens. He had imagined beauty, challenge, and solitude, not a prison made of snow. He had planned carefully, or so he thought. His pack had been filled with the basics: a small tent, a lightweight stove, food supplies for a few weeks, maps, a compass, and the tools he trusted: knife, hatchet, and saw. He wasn't inexperienced. He had camped in forests before, had walked trails for days with nothing but his gear. But Alaska was not the gentle woods of home. Alaska was wilder, colder, more merciless than anything he had ever faced. The first days were almost joyful. He remembered setting up camp near a frozen lake, where the silence was still friendly and the snow glittered under the low sun like a promise. He had brewed tea, warmed his hands by the small flame, and felt certain that he could last here as long as he wished. He had written in his journal, "This is exactly what I needed. Peace. A test of myself. A chance to breathe again." But peace had a way of vanishing. On the fourth night, the wind rose like a living thing, screaming through the trees, flattening his tent, and stealing his warmth. He had fought the canvas with frozen fingers until he gave up and crawled into the woods for shelter. By morning, his supplies were scattered, some lost under snowdrifts. He told himself it was just a setback. He didn't yet understand that out here, every setback was a threat to survival. Food had run lower than expected. The packets of rice and oatmeal he thought would stretch for weeks began to disappear far too quickly when his body demanded more calories to fight the cold. He had tried to hunt, setting simple snares and carrying his hatchet for small game. Sometimes he succeeded. Often he went hungry. Hunger was not a visitor. It became his shadow. Still, there had been moments of awe. He remembered the first time he saw the northern lights, green fire twisting across the black sky, so bright he felt he could reach up and touch it. For a moment, he had forgotten the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. For a moment, Alaska had shown him why people came here, to feel small against something so magnificent. But magnificence did not feed him. It did not keep him warm when the nights stretched into endless hours of darkness. Days blurred into each other. The journal entries grew shorter. The letters became cramped, shaky. The man who had come to Alaska searching for peace was slowly replaced by another man, one who counted each calorie, who measured his strength step by step, who no longer thought about home, but only about the next dawn. Now, on day 49, he looked back and understood. He had not miscalculated his supplies. He had miscalculated Alaska. The memory of the first storm still clung to him, sharper than hunger, louder than silence. It had arrived without warning, as though the sky had split open and emptied its fury all at once. One moment, the air was calm, the snow falling in gentle flakes. The next, a wall of wind slammed through the valley, tearing branches loose and turning the world into a whirl of white. He had been cooking then, water melting on the small stove, steam curling upward. At first he thought it was just a gust, a passing squall. But the wind didn't fade. It built, howling like some vast animal that had been waiting for him. The tarp above his tent snapped, the stakes groaned, and then the whole shelter collapsed around him in a flurry of canvas and snow. He remembered the panic, crawling on hands and knees, clawing at frozen fabric, trying to keep his supplies from vanishing into the storm. The stove toppled, the pot spilled, and suddenly the simple world he had built in 4 days was shredded. Snow poured in through every gap, soaking what little he owned. In that moment, he realized that out here, security was an illusion. When the storm finally eased, he was left with ruins. His sleeping bag was damp, his food half-buried, his hands shaking from exhaustion. He tried to light a fire, but the wind snuffed every match. Only after hours of shivering under a spruce tree did the air calm enough for a flame to hold. He sat there, staring at the flicker like it was salvation itself. That night was the first time he truly feared he would die. The hunger and cold had been enemies before, but abstract ones. The storm had been different. It was active, alive, a reminder that this land did not care if he lived or not. He was only another figure swallowed by snow. Yet survival often blooms from despair. The next morning, with red eyes and blistered hands, he built something new. A wall of snow blocks to guard his shelter, a trench to trap cold air, a roof pitched lower to cut the wind. Every cut of the saw, every shove of the shovel was a vow. If the storm came again, it would not find him so unprepared. He had thought he came to Alaska seeking peace, but in the echo of that storm, he understood. He wasn't here for peace. He was here for war. Silence had become his companion, but not a gentle one. At first it had felt like peace, freedom from the constant hum of traffic, the chatter of strangers, the ceaseless ringing of his phone. But now, weeks later, the silence was sharper, heavier. It pressed against his ears, filled the nights until he could almost hear it breathing with him. Loneliness was a different kind of predator. Hunger he could manage with discipline, cold with fire. But loneliness crept into his thoughts when he closed his eyes. Sometimes he woke in the dark, convinced he had heard footsteps outside the shelter. Other times he dreamed of voices, his mother calling him to dinner, a friend laughing at a joke, the familiar buzz of city life. Waking from those dreams hurt worse than the cold. He thought often of home, not just the physical place, but the life he had left behind. His apartment had been small, cluttered with books and old maps. He remembered the desk by the window where he used to sit late into the night, reading about explorers who crossed mountains and oceans. He had always wondered what it would feel like to be truly tested, to face the world with nothing but his own hands. That was where the idea of Alaska had been born, not out of recklessness, but out of longing. He wanted to strip away the noise of the world, to step outside of schedules and alarms, to discover who he was when nothing was left but the basics. Food, fire, shelter. Perhaps he thought he would come back stronger, clearer, carrying some wisdom to set against the dull rhythm of ordinary days. But the silence had become too vast, too merciless. There were moments when he wished he could share it with someone. Anyone, a single voice in the night, a partner to laugh at the absurdity of boiling snow for water, a companion to remind him he wasn't just a ghost moving through a frozen land. Instead, there was only his own voice, whispering to himself like a man afraid of vanishing. One evening, as the fire cracked softly in his shelter, he pulled his journal close and wrote, "I wanted solitude. I did not understand what solitude really was. Solitude is not peace. Solitude is a mirror that shows you everything you are afraid to see." The page trembled in his hands, and for the first time he realized he had come to Alaska not to escape the noise of the world, but to escape himself. Hunger had turned from discomfort into obsession. It was no longer a dull ache he could ignore with tea or willpower. It was a constant voice, loud and demanding, urging him to act. On the 49th day, his ribs felt sharper under his skin, his belt looser around his waist. Every step he took burned more calories than he could afford to lose. Food was no longer just sustenance. It was survival measured hour by hour. At first, he had trusted the supplies he carried. Rice, oats, dried meat, a few tins. But storms, mistakes, and endless days had stripped those away. What remained was meager, scraps he rationed with near-religious discipline. So he turned to the land. He built snares from wire, checked game trails for tracks, and studied the snow as if it were a book he could learn to read. The first time a snare came up empty, he told himself it was expected. The second time, disappointment hit harder. By the 5th day without success, he was cursing his own knots, the placement of the wire, even the animals themselves. as though they were deliberately avoiding him. He knew better. Of course, the wilderness owed him nothing, but frustration gnawed at him nearly as sharply as hunger did. One morning, he found rabbit tracks pressed deep into the snow. His pulse quickened. He followed them carefully, moving slowly so as not to spook the animal. The prints led him through a tangle of willows, then across an open stretch where the snow glittered in the weak sunlight. At last, in the distance, he spotted a snowshoe hare, ears tall, body camouflaged almost perfectly against the white. He crouched, every muscle tense. Slowly, he raised his hatchet. He had no bow, no rifle, only speed and desperation. For a moment, time held still. Then he lunged. The hare darted, and snow exploded around them. He missed. His hand struck only air and powder. The hare vanished into the trees, leaving only frantic prints behind. He knelt there, gasping, fury and despair burning hotter than the cold. That failure nearly broke him. He sat in the snow for a long time, listening to his own ragged breaths, wanting to give up, but giving up meant death, and some stubborn ember deep inside refused to let him stop. He stood again, brushed the snow from his knees, and reset his snares. 2 days later, he found success. A hare, caught cleanly in the wire loop, lay still in the snow. Relief flooded him, so strong it brought tears to his eyes. His hands trembled as he lifted the animal, whispering a quiet thanks, not to any god in particular, but to the wilderness itself, for sparing him a little longer. That night, when the pot boiled with meat and steam filled the shelter, he felt alive again. The hunger was never gone, but now he knew this truth. Out here, every mouthful was a victory, and every victory bought him one more day. Night in Alaska was not merely darkness. It was a force. The sun dipped low, the horizon swallowed the last light, and the cold crept in with a cruelty that felt deliberate. Every sound became sharper, every shadow heavier. Inside his shelter, he learned that surviving the night was not about sleeping. It was about enduring hour after hour until the faint light of dawn returned. His sleeping bag, damp from the storm days earlier, had never truly dried. It smelled of smoke and wool, and the insulation clumped together in patches. Sometimes he woke shivering so violently that his teeth ached. He had learned to heat a bottle of water on the stove, tuck it between his thighs, and trap what warmth he could. Without it, the night became unbearable. Fire was both salvation and risk. The small stove hissed and popped as snow melted in the pot, steam curling into the cramped shelter. But every flicker of flame was a reminder of the limited fuel. Each canister weighed less every day, and he rationed them like gold. He often asked himself, "Do I use fire tonight for comfort, or save it for tomorrow when I might need it more?" There were no right answers, only choices, and each choice had consequences. The darkness outside was alive. Some nights, he heard the cry of wolves carried on the wind, distant but haunting. Once, he woke to a scratching sound near the meat he had hung in a spruce. With shaking hands, he grabbed his hatchet and stepped outside, only to find a fox darting away, its eyes glowing briefly in the firelight. Encounters like that left him restless, alert long after the danger was gone. What haunted him most, though, was not the predators. It was the silence between them, the endless hours when nothing moved, when the stillness pressed against his chest until it felt hard to breathe. He found himself whispering aloud, telling fragments of stories from his past, as if words could keep the night from swallowing him. In those long hours, memories came. He thought of his family gathered around a dinner table, laughter mixing with the clatter of dishes. He remembered the smell of his mother's cooking, the way his father's hand rested steady on his shoulder. He thought of friends in warm bars, of music, of lights glowing in city windows. These memories were both comfort and torment. Comfort, because they reminded him he was not always alone. Torment, because they felt like another life, unreachable now. There were moments he nearly convinced himself he would never leave Alaska, that this frozen wilderness would be his grave. But then the first pale light of dawn would seep through the cracks of his shelter, and something inside him would shift. He was still alive, and as long as he could see another sunrise, he refused to surrender. Night was not rest. Night was trial, and every morning he survived it, he felt both older and sharper, as though the darkness had carved pieces of him away, leaving only what was necessary. By the 7th week, he knew the land almost as well as his own body. He could tell from the texture of snow whether it had fallen in the night or days before. He knew the smell of spruce resin when the trees cracked in the cold, the hollow sound when his boots crossed frozen muskeg, the way alder branches bent low with ice. The wilderness was no longer a stranger. It was a harsh teacher, and he its unwilling pupil. He had read, before coming, that Alaska was home to giants. The Alaskan moose, the largest of its kind, could weigh over 1,000 pounds and wander silently through the birch groves. Brown bears and black bears roamed river valleys, their strength legendary. Wolves hunted in packs across the boreal forests, following trails cut by caribou and hare. Lynx, foxes, and owls haunted the edges of the night. All of them lived here. All of them had survived where men often failed. One evening, while checking his snares along a game trail, he noticed the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds, the chatter of chickadees, the tapping of a woodpecker, had vanished. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. His gut tightened. He remembered what he had read. Silence in the forest often meant a predator was near. And then he saw it. At the far end of the trail, half hidden among the spruce trunks, a shape moved. Large, deliberate, heavy. For a moment, he thought it was a moose. But then the head rose, the shoulders broad, the fur a dark brown shadow against the snow. A bear. The animal paused, sniffing the air, its breath steaming in the cold. His own breath caught in his throat. He had no rifle, no means of defense beyond a hatchet and the thin blade of his knife. He remembered the advice he had memorized. Don't run, don't shout, don't turn your back. Bears could outrun a man in seconds. Panic would only make him prey. Slowly, he lowered his gaze, keeping the animal in his vision. His heart pounded so hard it seemed impossible the bear couldn't hear it. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the bear turned, lumbering off into the deeper forest, vanishing between snow-draped trees as silently as it had appeared. He exhaled, knees trembling. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the space where the animal had been. The encounter left him shaken, but also humbled. This land was not his. It belonged to the creatures who had lived here long before him, and would remain long after. That night, as he sat by the weak glow of his fire, he thought about what it meant to be human in a place like this. He was not master, not conqueror. He was just another animal, fragile and desperate, surviving on borrowed time in a kingdom of giants. It happened so quickly he almost laughed at the absurdity, until the pain came. He had been splitting frozen spruce for kindling when the hatchet slipped, biting a shallow cut across his palm. Blood welled bright against the pale skin, steaming in the cold air. For a moment, he simply stared, almost detached, as though the hand belonged to someone else. Then the sting hit, sharp and merciless. He wrapped it quickly with a strip torn from the lining of his shirt, pressing hard to slow the bleeding. Infection was his greatest fear. Out here, even a small wound could become deadly. He rinsed the cut with melted snow water, hissing as the freezing liquid burned the raw skin, then bound it tighter. The hand throbbed, each heartbeat echoing inside the wound. But the cut was only one problem. His body, worn down by hunger and cold, had begun to rebel. He woke one morning with fever, his head pounding, muscles weak. The shelter that had once felt small and protective now seemed like a trap, holding the sour smell of sweat and sickness. Every movement cost him effort. Every sip of water churned in his stomach before settling. He knew he needed rest. But rest here was dangerous. Rest meant slipping into stillness, and stillness meant not waking again. That was when he discovered the worst truth. His last fuel canister was empty. He had twisted the valve, shaken the metal, listened for the faint slosh that wasn't there. Nothing. The stove that had carried him through nights of snow and hunger hissed its final breath. Panic almost overtook him. No fire meant no warmth, no boiled water, no hot food. But panic would kill him faster than cold. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to remember what he had prepared for. Deep in his pack, wrapped in cloth, was his ferro rod, the backup, the ancient tool of sparks and persistence. That evening, with trembling hands and fever still burning, he scraped bark from a dead birch log. He dug into the snow beneath the trees, pulling out branches that the wind had kept dry, testing them by snapping until he found those that cracked clean. He shaved curls of wood, laying them in a nest, then struck steel to ferro. Sparks hissed and died. He struck again, until at last one ember caught, glowing weak and red, then flaring into flame. Relief nearly broke him. He cupped the fire close, feeding it carefully until the dry twigs snapped and roared. Heat spread into the shelter, and he felt it against his fevered skin like a blessing. He boiled water, sterilized the cloth for his wound, and swallowed tea as though it were medicine. The flame was more than fire. It was hope, torn back from the edge. That night, as the storm pressed against the tarp and his body shivered under sweat and fever, he whispered to the fire, "Don't leave me. Not tonight." The fever broke after 2 nights, but it left him hollow, weaker than before. His legs trembled when he walked. His hands shook when he tried to tie knots or carve tinder. Even lifting the pot of boiling water felt like a task too heavy for him. The wilderness had taken much already, and now it felt as if it wanted to take his will as well. The days blurred. He no longer counted them carefully, 49, 50, 51, because the numbers mocked him. Each sunrise felt less like hope and more like another reminder that rescue had not come. He often sat by the dying fire, staring at the coals until his vision blurred, wondering why he kept fighting at all. His journal grew darker too, where once he had written observations about the trees, the tracks in snow, the way ravens circled above. Now the entries were brief, bitter lines, cold, weak, alone. Sometimes he wrote nothing at all, staring at the blank page until he set it aside. The silence became dangerous. It was no longer just emptiness outside his shelter. It had begun to fill his head. He thought he heard voices in the night, faint and familiar. Once he swore he heard his mother call his name. Another time, he thought he heard the low murmur of a radio, as if a cabin full of people was nearby. But when he crawled outside into the cold, there was nothing. Only snow, trees, and the whisper of wind. Food was dwindling again. His snares sometimes caught nothing for days. He chewed strips of bark, boiled spruce needles into bitter tea. The taste was sharp, resinous, almost medicinal, but it quieted his stomach for a while. Still, hunger made him dizzy, and when he stood too quickly, the world tilted sideways. There were moments when he thought about lying down in the snow and letting it end. The thought frightened him, not because of death itself, but because it no longer seemed unthinkable. The wilderness whispered that it would be easy, painless, almost peaceful. He fought against that whisper with everything he had left. One afternoon, as the weak sun slid low behind the spruce, he whispered to himself, "If I die out here, no one will know. My story will vanish under the snow." The thought ignited a flicker of defiance. He refused to let the land erase him without a fight. If he had to scratch his story into the bark of every tree, he would. Despair was strong, but he clung to something stronger. The stubborn, quiet belief that survival itself was a form of victory. It was the 55th day when something shifted. The sky, usually a low ceiling of gray, opened into a pale blue dome. The sun, sharp and glaring, bounced off the snow so fiercely that his eyes watered. That morning he had forced himself outside, weak but determined, to check the snares along the tree line. Hunger gnawed, but the cold air brought a strange clarity. And then he saw them. Tracks. Not rabbit, not moose. Boots. Human boots. He crouched, staring as though his eyes were tricking him. The edges were fresh, not yet blurred by wind. Someone else had walked here. For the first time in weeks, he was not the only mark on the snow. His pulse thundered in his ears. He followed, step by careful step, whispering under his breath, "Please, let them still be close." The trail led across a frozen creek and into dense spruce. He knew better than to hope too hard, but he couldn't help it. Every print felt like a thread pulling him back to life. But the sight of those prints also pulled his thoughts backward, to the beginning, to how he had ended up in this trap of ice and silence. He had set out from a ranger trailhead with maps and confidence. The first days had been easy, following marked paths, rivers to guide him, compass steady in hand. But storms had swallowed landmarks, snow erased trails. His compass broke in the 4th week when he slipped on ice and fell hard onto rock. His maps, damp from the collapsed tent during the storm, blurred into useless smears. And so he had wandered deeper, each decision taking him farther from where rescue might come. He told himself he could retrace steps, but every tree looked the same, every ridge familiar and strange. Alaska's forests were endless, spruce and fir and alder stretching in every direction, their black trunks lined with snow. Without a clear path, he became a ghost walking in circles. He had thought once about trying to march south, to follow the sun, but the valleys bent and twisted, the mountains blocked his way. Hunger slowed him, storms drove him back into the trees, and each day his world shrank smaller. First to miles, then to steps, then to the tiny circle of firelight that kept him alive. Now, kneeling over those prints, he felt both hope and fear. If someone else was here, perhaps they could lead him out, or perhaps they too had been lost. Their trail, ending somewhere beneath the snow. That night, when he sat by his carefully fed fire, he heard a new sound, a faint drone above the valley. He stumbled outside, heart racing, and lifted his eyes to the sky. A plane, a small bush plane, the kind locals used to reach remote cabins, crossed the horizon, its wings flashing in the last orange of the sunset. He shouted, waving his arms until his shoulders ached. His voice cracked, torn raw by cold and desperation. The plane didn't circle. It passed, steady, vanishing into the distance. But he had seen it, proof the world still existed, that people were not so impossibly far away. Even if it hadn't seen him, it reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. He was not truly alone. Clutching his journal to his chest that night, he whispered, "Not yet. My story isn't finished. Not yet." On the 57th day, the pale sun climbed slowly over the trees, its light striking the snow without warmth. The man stepped out of the shelter, each movement stiff from weakness. For a while he just stood there, staring at the endless white, and the memory of the plane from 2 days earlier gnawed at him. It had passed without a glance, leaving him shouting into silence. Since then, the weight of despair had grown heavier, whispering that hope was only a cruel illusion. The valley around him lay still, the kind of silence that made the mind invent sounds. He listened, half believing it was only in his imagination, until a faint vibration reached his ears. A hum, distant but rising. His breath caught. This was no wind, no trick of memory. It was real. Snow sprayed as he stumbled into the open, arms waving desperately. His voice cracked as he screamed, throat burning. For a moment, the aircraft seemed ready to slip away, as the last one had, but then the wings dipped, banking low over the valley. Sunlight flashed across the fuselage. He collapsed to his knees, tears freezing on his skin. A flare tumbled downward, splitting into red smoke against the white sky. At last, someone had seen him. The hours that followed came in fragments. Packing the few belongings left, an axe, scraps of clothing, the battered journal pressed against his chest. He barely felt his own hands moving. Then a new sound came, heavier, more powerful, the chopping thunder of rotors. Snow exploded around him as the helicopter descended, bending the spruces and scouring his face with ice. To most it would have been a storm. To him it was salvation. The door slid open and rescuers leaned out, their voices carrying through the roar. Somehow his body kept moving, each step drawn out of him by sheer will. Pain surged through his legs, his lungs burned, but he walked on. This was no longer about survival. This was the road home. Hands caught hold, strong and steady. A voice cut through the noise. "We've got you. You're safe." The words shattered the walls inside him. Weeks of silence gave way to warmth and presence. He collapsed into the cabin, trembling, letting the tears come freely. Through the small window, the wilderness shrank. The forests, the ridges, the valleys that had nearly taken his life. Relief filled him, but sorrow too. A part of him would always remain in that frozen silence. A blanket wrapped around his shoulders, a bottle of water pressed into his hands. He drank, coughing, the taste so simple yet so miraculous. As the helicopter turned south, he pressed the journal to his chest. His story had not ended in the snow. It had survived. For 57 days, he was alone in the Alaskan wilderness. Now, at last, he was going home.